So yeah, it's been a while since my last video, hasn't it? A lot more than 2 weeks like I originally planned at the end of my Series 5 review. Well, I've had my hands tied with, moving stuff into my student accommodation as well as other stuff that I wanted to do before I left. But now, I'm back, and I'm ready to tackle what is quite a large project for this review series. Whether you're a fan of the series or not, this film is quite common in people's childhoods, for better or for worse, depending on who you ask, and as of the time of this video, is officially 21 years old. The Little Blue Tank Engine's cinematic debut that would later spell the beginning of the show's first downfall, unfortunately. What was supposed to be Britt Allcroft and her company's most ambitious title slowly turned into what is either remembered as a fun, nostalgic memory or a big disappointment to the franchise, depending on who you ask. Let's do this. Let's take a look into the film that is Thomas and the Magic Railroad.
He's a really useful engine, you know. All the other engines, they'll tell you so. He huffs and puffs and whistles, rushing to and fro. He's the really useful engine we adore. He's a really useful engine, you know. 'Cause the Fat Controller, he told him so. Now he's got a punchline to call his very own. He's the really useful engine we adore. He's the one, he's the number one. He's the really useful engine we adore.
To really get into discussing this film, I first need to talk about the history of how the show was brought into the United States. Something I haven't talked about much in the previous reviews, at all. So let me take you back to 1998, 2 years after Series 2 was first broadcast in the United Kingdom, where Britt Allcroft began working on trying to launch the series in the States. There was no clear thoughts from what Wilbert thought about this idea, but I think it's fair to say he wouldn't have warmed up to the idea, given how way back in 1974 there was a pitch plan for adapting the books into a black and white 2D cartoon in America, very similar to the Disney animated shorts of the 1930s and 1940s. Wilbert rejected this idea and, when asked about the attempt in an interview, said, once the Americans get hold of it, the whole series would be vulgarised and ruined. Something tells me he didn't like it very much. Just a hunch. One of the bigger problems faced by the production team that had previously prevented them from broadcasting the show in the US was their stricter broadcasting schedules compared to the UK, meaning instead of 5-minute episodes of TV shows here in England, America had TV shows that had to be a minimum of 28 minutes. Britt would strike a deal with US broadcasting company PBS and TV producer Rick Sigelkow to produce a kids' sitcom-style show that would incorporate episodes of Thomas and Friends into its plot, and thus, in 1989, the show that would become the vessel for bringing Thomas and Friends to America was born, Shinning Time Station.
Reach for the speed, reach for the whistle, go where the rail may run. Reach for the words, reach for the story, follow the rainbow sun. To a shining time station, where dreams can come true, waiting there for you.
The show was comprised of a group of kids who spent their time hanging out at a train station of the same name, with older characters such as station manager Stacey Jones, railroad engineer, station handyman and driver of the Rainbow Sun train on the Indian Valley Railroad, Billy Two Feathers, and the scheming owner of the station arcade, Horace Schemer. Perhaps the most prominent reoccurring adult character was Mr. Conductor, a 20cm tall man who, in the context of the show, has travelled to the island of Sodor itself and knows a lot of stories from that railway. He would tell the stories to the children, who would learn the morals of said story depending on what obstacle they were facing in the episode of Shining Time Station. This was done by Mr. Conductor blowing his whistle to make a cloud of steam appear, and then an episode of the show would play, thereby seamlessly incorporating Thomas and Friends into the show. And yes, your eyes do not deceive you, that is indeed Ringo Starr playing Mr. Conductor, shrunk down to 20 centimetres after being filmed in front of a blue screen. I wonder if he ever got blisters on his fingers from having to climb the stairs. As a result of bringing the show to America, a lot of the episode titles and the narration had to be changed to fit their terminology, mainly with trucks instead being called freight cars.
Gordon was very cross. Instead of nice shining coaches, he was pulling a lot of very dirty trucks. A goods train, a goods train, a goods train, he grumbled. The shame of it, the shame of it, oh, the shame of it. Edward laughed and went to find some more trucks. Gordon was very cross. Instead of nice shining coaches, he was pulling a very dirty freight train. A freight train, a freight train, a freight train, he grumbled. The shame of it, the shame of it, oh, the shame of it. Edward laughed and went to find some more freight cars.
And instead addressing the Fat Controller as Sir Topham Hatt.
Eventually, even the Fat Controller gave up. Eventually, even Sir Topham Hatt gave up. It was full of important people, like the Fat Controller. It was full of important people, like Sir Topham Hatt.
I mean, that is calling him by his real name, but I don't know why they didn't call him the Fat Controller in the US. I think it might have hit too close to home. On top of that, I'm guessing as a way to simplify the morals for a young American audience, a lot of the dialogue was changed, and I mean a lot of it.
Gordon began making his plan. Yes, said Gordon, I will. Gordon, the proud engine, began making his plan to teach Thomas a lesson for teasing him. He forgot all about Edward and didn't wait to say thank you. Edward was left out of breath and far behind. He ran on to the next station, and there he found that the driver and fireman were very pleased with him. He forgot all about kind Edward and didn't say thank you. Edward was left out of breath and far behind, but he was happy because he had been so helpful. At the next station, he found that the driver and fireman were very pleased with him. James tried to get his own back, talking about engines who got shut up in tunnels and stuck on hills. James tried to get back by talking about Henry, who got shut up in a tunnel, and Gordon, who got stuck on a hill.
This is going to make me sound like a nitpicky arsehole, but I think this kind of ruins the show. The morals aren't as subtle, and in some occasions the stories are softer and aren't as mature, and are more played down to kids. He went home very slowly, and was careful afterwards never to be cheeky to Gordon again. Maybe I don't have to tease Gordon to feel important, Thomas thought to himself, and he puffed slowly home. We shall take away your rails, he said, and leave you here for always and always and always. We shall take away your rails, he said, and leave you here until you're ready to come out of the tunnel. Sudden dirt from the tunnel had spoilt his lovely green paint and red stripes anyway. He wondered if he would ever be allowed to pull trains again. But I think he deserved his punishment. Don't you? Sudden dirt from the tunnel had spoilt his lovely green paint and red stripes anyway. How long do you think Henry will stay in the tunnel before he overcomes his fear of the rain and then decides to journey out again? Oh dear, thought Henry, why did I worry about rain spoiling my lovely coat of paint? Will the Fat Controller ever forgive me and let me out again? Oh dear, thought Henry, why did I worry about rain spoiling my lovely coat of paint? I'd like to come out of the tunnel, but Henry didn't know how to ask. The Fat Controller spoke to him too. You're too expensive, Henry. Sir Topham Hatt spoke to him too. What's wrong with you, Henry? Rubbish, said Thomas. You're too fat, you need exercise. Rubbish, said Thomas. You're too slow. You need exercise. James had not seen the Fat Controller for several days. He was left alone for being naughty and was not even allowed out to push coaches and trucks in the yard. Oh dear, he thought, I shall have to stay in the shed for always, and no one will see my red coat again. James had not been out to push coaches or freight cars in the yard for several days. He was feeling miserable.
dear, he thought. I wonder how long I shall have to stay in the shed. Will anyone see my red coat again?
It's not insulting their intelligence too much, but then you get Mr. Conductor actively telling the characters the moral instead of leaving the audience to think about it. Or maybe that's just me being a proud, snobby Brit. But despite that, Shining Time did do very well, and a lot of kids in America became fans of Thomas and Friends. However, after the first season, Ringo would leave his role as both Mr. Conductor and narrator for Thomas and Friends to pursue his music career. As we know, this is where Angelis would take over the role as narrator for the show in the UK. So who was brought in as Mr. Conductor? American comedian George Carlin. I mean, come on the surface he just seems like the right guy for the job, right?
And I wanted to know the ones that you could never say on television. I mean the filthy words that are always filthy. Ass is all right on television. You can say on television things like, well, you've made a perfect ass of yourself tonight. But you can't say, hey, let's go get some ass.
Here's another male cliche. These guys who cut the sleeves off of their t-shirts so the rest of us can have an even more compelling experience of smelling their armpits. I say, hey, Bruno, shut it down, would you please? You smell like an anchovy's okay? Yeah, not good.
Well, he did stay for what would be the last 2 seasons of the show before its end on PBS in 1997, with a couple of other broadcasters keeping it on the air for just a little while longer. Not only narrating the new 3rd and 4th series for Thomas and Friends, but also completely redid the first 2 series originally narrated for America by Ringo, some of which Ringo had never done for the US.
Thomas the Tank Engine is very proud of his branch line. He thinks it is the most important part of the whole railway.
There are 2 ways of doing things, Duck told them. The Great Western Way or the wrong way. I'm Great Western and don't we know it, they groaned.
Thomas the Tank Engine was feeling bright and cheerful. It was a splendid day. Good morning, he whistled to some cows, but the cows didn't reply. Never mind, said Thomas, they're busy with their breakfast.
The Queen's train glided into the station. Gordon was spotless and his brass shone brightly.
According to George himself, this was an opportunity for people to see a different side to him, a wide-eyed, childlike but wise friend to children.
It won me a whole new generation of admirers who knew nothing about George Carlin except that he was a little man in a little blue suit. When I ran into one of these kids at the airport and the parents would say, that's him, go over and say hello, the child was always completely fucking traumatized. I was out of uniform and way too big. I had to say gently, I'm not on the island of Sodor. I'm not working today, but I am Mr. Conductor. Then that wonderful look would come on the child's face. What the fuck is going on?
That's just really sweet. I mean, I still prefer Ringo and Michael's narration because they're the narrations I grew up with, but he's still really good from the episodes I've heard him do. I could just hear how much fun he's having with characters like Donald and Douglas.
You're a muckle nuisance, said Donald. It's to leave you behind I be wanting. Anyone would think, said Douglas, that Donald had had his accident on purpose. I heard tell about an engine and some tar wagons. Douglas gasped. Don't mention that word. It makes me wheels wobble.
And little would he know, years later those same kids would grow up and go to his comedy sketches before his death in 2008. Knowing that George, in all his wacky adult roles, had one kids show role that left a huge impact on their childhoods is awesome. And yes, people have done the inevitable and combined clips from his sketches with clips from the show, and the results are...
Beep, beep. Good morning, Percy, he whistled. Driving is fun, isn't it? Did you ever run over a guy, huh? And then you panic, so you back up and run over him again? Did you ever notice the second crunch is not as loud as the first?
Yes, Thomas, of course, but what, Percy? Out with it.
I think it's because the guy already has tread marks on him. Might as well run over him again. What are you going to do this time? Drive around him? I think you are both sorry and deserve a treat. Edward will go in front to clear the line. Thomas will look after the coaches, and Gordon run into a bakery and ask if they can bake a cake in the shape of a penis.
So after Shining Time ended, Series 4 of Thomas and Friends was the first to be released in the US straight to VHS or home video depending on your preference of name, and that would be the way the show would continue to be released in America for a while. George Carlin would later depart the series after narrating Series 4, so for Series 5, another American narrator was needed. Enter actor Alec Baldwin. Again, not much to say about him given that I grew up with the UK dubs, but to me, his narration was alright, I think. His typical lines for explaining what was going on weren't really that expressive, but his voices for some of the characters were really where he stood out. For better or worse, I'll let you decide.
Why does Percy want to wish us good luck? Asked Bill. Because he knows we'll need it. A diesel with toothache must be the worst diesel of all.
Why does Percy want to wish us good luck? Asked Bill. Because he knows we'll need it. A diesel with a toothache must be the worst diesel of all.
Oh, look. It's a little green goblin on wheels. You'll be scrapped. Just you wait and see.
Oh, look. It's a little green goblin on wheels. You'll be scrapped. Just you wait and see.
You're a very useful brake van, Toad. You help me brake, and you keep my trucks in order when we go down hills. I know, Mr. Oliver, but it would be so exciting to go forwards for a change instead of always seeing things sliding away from me.
You're a very useful brake van, Toad. You help me brake, and you keep my freight cars in order when we go down hills. I know, Mr. Oliver, but it would be so exciting to go forwards for a change instead of always seeing things sliding away from me.
Owls, mists, ghosts. Edward's going soft in the boiler. There's no mist.
Owls, mists, ghosts. Edward's going soft at the boiler. There's no mist.
One big example I want to point out is with James. You know how Michael turned him into a full-on scouser?
What's that, Duck? He snorted. Are you afraid of bees? They're only insects after all. What's the matter, Henry? There's no rain today. Stop worrying and do some work instead. Just here,
he grumbled.
Well, Baldwin's voice for James was instead very... what's the word I'm looking for? Flamboyant.
You should see the situation from Cranky's point of view. Despicable, agreed James. Oh my goodness! What was that? Exclaimed James. Oh, please. Being important is the only thing for me to think about. Huh. You know how much you like the forest.
I'll leave it at that.
Oh, please.
So, with the success of both Thomas and Shining Time Station in the US, Britt made plans to incorporate both these shows together in a feature-length film, originally striking a deal with the then vice-chairman of Paramount Pictures, Barry London. Allcroft signed a contract to write the script for the film. It was due to start filming at Shepperton Studios, where the original series of Thomas and Friends was filmed, and due to be released in 1997, but Barry London left the company and Paramount shelved the film idea, forcing Britt to seek other forms of funding. Which thankfully came in 1999 when Barry became chairman of the newly founded Destination Films and renewed his interest in the project, so production was back on track. I'm sorry, that joke was fucking awful. But yeah, a bit of a hiccup with the planning, but everything seems to be going alright so far. Britt, who's been involved with the series since the very beginning, wants to make a film that brings our favourite characters to the big screen. The same model team is involved. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Everything went wrong. If I can credit the best thing about Thomas and the Magic Railroad, it's that the behind-the-scenes story on how it was meant to be is incredibly fascinating. The final film, according to Allcroft when asked about the film years later in 2007, was drastically different to the version she had originally intended audiences to see, which the PDF of her originally written script can be found online. And having read the script myself, I can say that while the plot mostly stayed the same, a lot of things were cut out. The biggest thing being cut out was the film's human villain, P.T. Boomer. Portrayed by late Canadian actor Doug Lennox, he was set to be the main antagonist of the entire film and the arch-enemy slash former friend to one of the film's characters, Burnett Stone. But the test audiences found him too scary for children, so he was cut from the final film. This was around the time that the internet was still somewhat in its early days, so there was no online fandoms to give test footage leaks, behind the scenes shots or other stuff like that. God knows how different this film would be if groups of toxic fans bullied the production team to make changes if they were already bowing to the whim of the bloody test audience. And unfortunately, this would not be the only thing the test audience would interfere with. They also didn't take too well to the character voices. Thomas was originally going to be voiced by fireman and part-time taxi driver John Bellis, who Britt had met on set of filming on the Isle of Man, believing his voice was perfectly suited for Thomas, so he was flown to Toronto to record his lines, some of which can actually be heard in an early trailer and demo reels of the film.
Little engines can do big things.
Well, who else were you expecting? Don't worry, I'm on my way. No, you won't. I'll save a seat for you.
Run, lady, quickly, and I'm going to help you.
Sodor Railway. Really reliable and right on time. And you're being bossy, Gordon.
This was changed because the test audiences said he sounded too old, so he was replaced by a younger sounding Canadian actor, Eddie Glenn. The same was also done for James and Percy, originally meant to be voiced by Michael Angelis, but test audiences also deemed his voice to be too old for the characters, so they were then replaced by Susan Roman and Linda Ballantine. Patrick Breen as Splatter and Dodge was for unknown reasons replaced by Neil Crone and Kevin Frank, and finally Keith Scott as the main Diesel antagonist Diesel 10 was changed because his voice was also deemed too scary, so ended up being replaced by Neil Crone, who originally gave him a Russian accent before test audiences deemed it too offensive, so Neil gave him a New Jersey accent instead. Let me get this straight. Parents thought this was too scary to show to kids.
Things are gonna change around here, puffball.
Okay, Burnett! The clothes are off!
But stuff like this, and this, and this didn't scare kids at all. You confuse me, American parents of the late 90s and the early 2000s, because that was around the time this film came out. I doubt people are like that nowadays. Who am I kidding? Of course that's what they're like. While this would be the last of the heavy changes from requests from the test audience, many changes were still made from the original script. Burnett's granddaughter Lily was originally going to be the narrator of the story, telling it to her kids. George the Steamroller was going to make an appearance as one of Diesel 10's lackeys, who Diesel 10 said if they succeeded would be rewarded by letting him destroy the turntable and turning it into a roller rink before changing his mind and not helping them in the film's climax, something that I think would have given George good character development. The Magic Engine Lady would have not been given a voice and instead communicate through telepathy, an ending where not only is Thomas present with Lady and the human characters, but Percy and James too. Billy Two Feathers being given a much more prominent role compared to his eventual role in the final cut, etc, etc, etc. So many things that were all just cut out. As a media student, I get that stuff happens that's out of your control on how the final product will turn out. Whether you're an up-and-coming indie filmmaker or a Hollywood film company, things will be left on the cutting room floor. It's just as someone who has now read the full original script by Britt, those original plot points, small as they may seem to have been cut out, would have made for a much more engaging film. However, when I say that, I don't mean it to be a great film, because the film itself is still Thomas and the Magic Railroad. Without jumping too far ahead to discussing the story yet, there were a lot of plot elements and bits of dialogue that I was surprised to see part of the original script when I read it. The biggest one being Shining Time being set in the real world, while the island of Sodor was supposedly a magical faraway land. In that respect, it feels more like a Shining Time film rather than a Thomas film, if they're going for their own continuity of the world, given Mr. Conductor's magical presence talking about the stories from the show as if they were a magical land. But then Thomas's name is in the title. Thus, before the film has even begun, it's already completely misunderstood a fundamental quality to Thomas and Friends, and by extension its railway series origins, the real-life connections. The engines being based on real-life engine builds, a realistic railway with drivers, firemen and workers, connection to real-life railways, real-life engines and real-life historical figures like Queen Elizabeth. By turning all of that on its head and bringing in literal magic and other childish elements, from the poster alone you have turned the franchise into the very shows they mocked in their development and legacy of 5 brilliant, warm, fuzzy, relaxing, most of the time, and realistic series of episodes. But okay, say that you're willing to look past the island of Sodor being retconned into a magical island. I know it's a very big hurdle to jump over, but when you do that, what does this film have to offer? Does it have moments of joy and genuine good quality? Or is it overall a mediocre, if not outright bad film? With the history segment of this film over, let's begin this review proper by starting with the story. So, because this is a film, big surprise, we don't have a plethora of episode stories to talk about, but instead just one big story. This is where a lot of TV shows brought to film usually struggle. You have to tell a story that outdoes anything the show has done up to that point, but nothing too spectacular that makes future series feel lesser. So allow me to paraphrase the plot. In the world of both Shining Time and the island of Sodor, Mr. Conductor is going to Sodor to look after the engines while the Fat Controller, or in the film's description Sir Topham Hatt because American audiences, is taking a holiday. But an evil diesel by the name of Diesel 10 is lurking around the yards looking to find a so-called lost steam engine to destroy her and dominate the other steam engines. When Mr. Conductor arrives on the island only to lose his gold dust so he can't teleport away from Diesel 10, it's his journey to find the source of the gold dust and find out about the lost engine, both before Diesel 10 finds her and before Shining Time falls into disuse with him potentially being stuck on the island of Sodor forever. All the while, back in Shining Time, railroad engineer Burnett Stone, who lives high in the mountains, spends his days moping around and not being able to bring the lost engine lady back into steam, until his granddaughter Lily comes, who ends up on an adventure to Sodor and along the way might find a way to bring this lost engine back and thus bring energy back to the magic railroad. Straight away you might have noticed a major problem with this film's story, which is one of the first critiques that people have about the story. Yeah, this film isn't about Thomas. Oh, Thomas is definitely there, make no mistake, as are the other engines. Or at least most of them. Seeing as, when the Fat Controller went on his holiday, he seemed to take Edward, Duck, Donald, Douglas, Bill, Ben, Mavis, Terence, Trevor, Daisy, Boko, Stepney, Oliver, Toad and everyone from the Skarloey Railway with them, as they are nowhere to be seen. But yeah, Thomas is not the main character in this film, and again, his name is in the fucking title. It's like Michael Bay's Transformers films where the plot is mostly about the humans. When you see the poster with Optimus Prime, you go to see a film about Optimus Prime, not Mark Wahlberg cracking open a Bud Light on someone's car.
You better have insurance. Is your car? Huh?
The same way you don't go to see a film with Thomas on the poster to see Alec Baldwin have a psychological breakdown.
Beach. Beach, that's it! That's it!
I'll come back to that. He does have a role in this film's plot, in very massive air quotes there, towards the end of the film, taking Lily through the magic buffers to travel along the magic railroad to get her back to Shining Time, whilst taking a truck of Sodor coal thinking it ties into the clue of finding the source of the gold dust, which it does, but he mostly feels like the plot is just happening around him. Even in the climax of the film, when he and Lady make it back to Sodor, only to end up being chased by Diesel 10, again, he's after Lady. Thomas is just there. As I guess you could say he weakens part of the crumbling viaduct for Diesel 10 to fall down, but it was crumbling anyway. In the original script, Lady actually runs onto a siding whilst Thomas does a brave thing and leads Diesel 10 onto the bridge away from her and jumps across the collapsing gap which Diesel 10 and PT Boomer falls down. That's good. It gives Thomas a reason to be in the chase and gives him a shining heroic moment, if a bit ridiculous, to justify his importance in his own film. As is, he feels like a secondary inclusion. If your film where the character whose name is in the title has next to nothing to do with what's going on, you've already failed miserably. So, if we're to look at this more as a Shining Time film, how well does it introduce the UK to a show they've never heard of before? Poorly. Like, this isn't like you having to introduce Thomas and the engines on Sodor because, again, if Thomas is in the title, it's a given that you've watched the show. As for Shining Time, the US has the advantage of having that show released in their country for context on who the characters are. Who is Stacey Jones? Who is Billy? Why is Alec Baldwin dressed in a train conductor cosplay and is 20 centimeters tall? Who are the supposedly new characters that have never once been mentioned before? Or at least I assume, because I don't actually want to watch the show fully. Why is Sodor suddenly a magical island now? Where did the lost engine come from? Why does this magic railway need to be run on to stop it from losing magic? Why is it important that Mr. Conductor makes it back to Shining time if it's never really clear what his job is there? And why, of all situations in a magical kids film, is this plot taken 100% seriously? What I mean by that is, a lot of actors seem to be so melodramatic in their performance. I mean, to be fair, this is a very difficult script to work with, and I don't know what direction they were given on set, but Christ on a bike, this seems too serious. Peter Fonda actually gives a pretty good performance as Burnett Stone when he's being sad, distant and mourning the loss of his engine's magic, and that's good at showing how great an actor he was, may he rest in peace. But it doesn't fit in with a plot like this. That's not to say kids' films can't have serious acting and serious moments, they absolutely can. Some of the great Disney, Pixar and DreamWorks films for kids have mature moments in them, and they work because they feel natural to the film's tone and don't cause any mood whiplash. I mean shit, even the fucking classic series that this film was born from understood this, and this is made by the same production team. So what's the excuse? Take this scene for example where Burnett tells his assistant Patch about how Lady lost her magic.
Long ago, I made a mistake as Lady's caretaker. An evil diesel found Lady and threatened to destroy her. He chased her, used up all her coal. He made her go too fast. And then he crashed her. And I brought her here. I tried my best to fix her up. But I've never been able to make up for the mistake I made.
Having heard a man pour his heart out on how he lost a steam engine that meant so much to him, what do we cut to next? A comedy scene where a talking diesel is looking at his carving of his face in the mountain.
Inchi, you've captured the real me. I mean, that's beautiful. I could cry.
That transition doesn't work because the tone of that scene doesn't work. So not only is the concept of Shining Time explained so badly in this film, but the tone of certain scenes are just really off. Okay, so thinking about the Island of Sodor side of things, given how surprisingly little the engines contribute to the main plot and are just there to react to things aside from Diesel 10 and somewhat Thomas, how does Britt Allcroft as well as Ghislaine Films and Destination Pictures bring our beloved island and characters to the big screen? Well, I mean this deep in my heart when I say that the way this film's story portrays the Sodor characters is completely, absolutely, well and truly, unconditionally fine. The magic stuff, that's terrible. But I'm putting that blame on the Shining Time part of this film, as well as the fact that there seem to be no people on the island at all, as they probably didn't want to blend real life people with wooden figures. But in doing that, that makes you wonder what the engines on Sodor are pulling coaches for if no people inhabit the island. But aside from that, every scene on Sodor in terms of story is fine. Not great, not terrible, just fine. Oh, except for the flowers being used as a telephone, that was fucking dumb. Britt, were you okay when you wrote this? What did you smoke? Other than that, I don't really know what else to say about this film's story without breaking it apart piece by piece, which, if I did, would take forever. Like, not even the ending. The chase I already talked about, and the ending feels rushed and confusing to explain. The only thing I have left to nitpick is how Lady is brought back into steam. Burnett explains that he used every coal in the valley to try and bring her back into steam, to no avail, which ends up tying into the gold dust clue of using coal from Sodor. What coal in particular? Henry's special coal. What? Yep, not only do they have the same special Welsh coal, which they retcon to come from Sodor instead,
and I'm collecting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 trucks of special Island of Sodor coal for you.
But Henry, despite being in his new shape, still needs it.
Oh, thank you, Thomas. Special coal will make me feel much better.
This is a complaint that should only be a nitpick, but if you've seen my previous videos, you know how much I praised the original story of Henry and his coal beforehand. So the fact that they've almost completely thrown all of that aside for the sake of portraying Henry as just generically ill, even after his rebuild, pisses me off to my very core. Unfortunately, this would become a trend in a following kids entertainment series, which also pisses me off. But I don't feel it angers me so much there as it does here, seeing as when Hit made the mistake, I think that just came from the writers not doing enough research into Henry. This, however, was a mistake by Britt Allcroft herself and the rest of the production team that made those episodes in the first place. Like, did nobody stop and take a minute to consider what they were doing? It's a point in the film that actually goes by as quick as it comes on screen, but it really pisses me off that they made such a big mistake over one of their greatest story points in the original series. It's that dreadful to me. But I'm getting a bit off topic here, so I'll conclude my final thoughts on the story. At its best, it's a passable Thomas and Friends story when it's on Sodor and not focusing on the human characters, who are unfortunately a large chunk of the film. At its worst, when it does focus on the humans, it's a confusing, played down to children story with no clear introduction to the supposed real world of Shining Time that makes Sodor out to be something completely immature and babyish, and completely misunderstands its roots of both the show and the Reverend Audrey's books. So it's a bad plot. Seeing as this production features the appearance of real-life humans, we have to consider performance. I've already mentioned Peter Fonda as Burnett, so I'll instead talk about the others, starting with Alec Baldwin as Mr. Conductor. If Peter was trying to be the too serious guy, Alec is the trying too hard to be over-the-top, wacky, and sometimes flat-out stupid guy. I mean, he loses his way to the windmill on the island of Sodor. Why not just turn around and go back and catch a train? You can't miss them. Again, I don't think it's fair to put all the blame on him given that this is a very odd script to work with, but it just feels too pandering to children. His narration is about the same as in the show, only it's just the explaining what's happening parts, which, again, I find not all that lively or entertaining. And what about that random part where he just breaks the fourth wall?
And by the way, I think that you're going to help me and Thomas somewhere in this story.
They just drop that line in and then later on, follow up on it in the laziest way when he escapes Diesel 10.
Did you put all this here for me? But you must have known that I was coming. How kind of you. Oh, I'm at the windmill. Now that's what I call a perfect landing.
Hey look, I did that. Aren't I a special child? The only part of his performance I found endearing was the scene where he's preparing to leave his house to go to Sodor, and he sings the TV show theme to himself. Now that is wholesome. I also guess the genes carry on through the rest of his family because his cousin, Junior, played by Michael E. Rogers, is just outright brain dead. The laid-back, irresponsible surfer trope. I'm sure you guys have seen this character a million times in other stories. He does things for the sake of being childish, he'd rather just lay back and relax at the beach, and puts himself in danger, but makes fun out of the situation. Like when he climbs a windmill which throws him across the sky, landing on Diesel 10 where he decides to try surfing on him. If this was any other film, I'd sound like I'm on drugs. The fact that Mr. Conductor trusts him to take his role as conductor at the end of the film is something I'll never understand, but the scene means I can do stupid shit like this.
This is the way.
I would call Junior the dumbest character in the whole film, but that honour goes to Lily. Again, I have no idea what direction Mara Wilson was given to play this character, but I trust this wide-eyed, gormless performance wasn't her fault, as she's acted well in other stuff before this film, but this character is just so cheesy. So get this, she's going to visit her grandpa, but this dog named Mutt has to find some way of getting her to Shining Time first. So Mutt goes to the station he should have absolutely no idea she'd be there because he's never met her or knows where she lives, and guides her to the wrong train so she'll get off at Shining Time instead of Muffle Mountain where her grandpa is.
I don't suppose you know where track 3 is, do you? You do? Is it that one? Well, why not?
What realistic kid would ever fucking do that? Heck, why does she even need to go to Sodor with Junior? Like, to give Thomas a reason to go through the magic buffers and take the coal truck with him? That's a really thin excuse for justifying her character being there, who, once she gets to Sodor, just feels like she reacts to stuff. Again, I'm not putting all the blame on the actor. It's the writing of this character I can't comprehend. As for the other human characters, Patch, Stacy, and Billy, and Mutt the dog, they're just kind of there and do their own thing and aren't really that interesting characters. Their acting is solid, mainly from Diddy Conn as Stacy, given she's had her time in the show to play her character as naturally as possible, as well as Billy, this time played by Russell Means, who also does a fine job. but they don't do much other than Patch, whose story role is just taking Lily where the plot needs her to be. Not much else. But what about the new engine characters on Sodor? Diesel 10, Splatter, Dodge, and to a certain extent Lady. Diesel 10, while on the surface feels over the top and less like a villainous Diesel and more like a generic kids film villain, I can't deny he's an entertaining character to watch. He's the type of villain who likes to look intimidating, have a laugh to himself while plotting his schemes, and on occasion has goofy moments that make him not very scary. A lot of which I think comes from Neil Crode and Kevin Frank's improv as Diesel 10, Splatter and Dodge. I mean, it's just the generic villain talks to his dumb henchman tropes, but even that manages to get a chuckle out of me, and I have no problem admitting to that. Sometimes I'm laughing at how generic it is, other times it genuinely feels funny to me.
Boss, did you mean to let the roof fall in? All the way in?
Lady is probably the new engine character I have the least to say about. Like, even with the other engines having less screen time, they have the advantage of having history and development in the show, so we know these characters going in. Given that the original plan was to have Lady not be given a face and instead speak through telepathy, I get the feeling she was supposed to be this otherworldly entity who, despite not having a face, would have a sort of mystical energy presence that's also an engine. While a completely bombastic concept to Thomas and friends, I think this would have worked more in the film's favour, riding that line between an engine being faceless but carries heavy expression through her presence and movement. The show don't tell approach. Something that they seem to try in this film with having her whistle echo through the mountains as if she is an otherworldly presence trying to come back to life. Like, that's really cool, and that would have worked for this film. But no, when the railway comes back to life, she just gains a face and a voice by Britt Allcroft. So now we have the climax of the film to find out her personality through her facial expressions and her dialogue, and she has not much.
So, Burnett, you didn't forget about magic. It's safe inside you. I hope so. I think he will soon.
Now, Lily!
And helping each other brings to life the magic in all of us.
That's it. That's all the lines she has. And we're supposed to get a character from this? I'm sorry, but I don't see it. As for our main Sodor characters, they are all perfectly portrayed in this film. Or at least most of them, given my Henry rant earlier. I'm sad my favourite character wasn't done much justice, but hey, at least everyone else is in character. Thomas is kind and wants to be helpful, but on occasion can be cheeky to the others. Gordon is proud and boastful, but still a loyal friend to the engines. James is the smug and vain engine he's always been, who despite his attitude, means well. Percy is the young, almost childlike but loyal best friend to Thomas. And Toby is the wise and brave friend despite his old age, which definitely ranks him above his Series 5 portrayal, especially compared to Toby's discovery. Even Harold and Bertie have one short appearance and then they're off, but they too are very accurate. The other engines and characters are again missing, which I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with if they were just seen working in the background, but they're nowhere to be seen. See those passengers on board Bertie? Those are the only other humans on this island. The exclusion of Edward is what mostly seems weird to me, given that he's been a part of the main fleet since the first series, and was the first Audrey character ever conceptualised. But given how little the engines have to do with the Magic Railroad plot anyway, he probably wouldn't impact much besides giving Thomas someone else to talk to. But it would have been nice to see him. So to conclude, the Sodor characters are great, and the humans are not really that good. I'm starting to notice a pattern here. Not counting the behind the scenes fascination, the production and design is the best part of this film. Yeah, as a late 90s film released at the very start of the 2000s, there are some parts that are inevitably dated. The CGI is especially something that has unfortunately gotten worse as time goes on, which even for the year 2000 wasn't that good, And in my case, watching this on a HD TV at a high frame rate, it looks more and more like a pre-rendered animation on a PlayStation 2 game. And since I like to talk about the production problems together, one other way this film falters is its editing. Not the mood whiplash pacing, because that's the writing's fault. I'm talking mainly about smaller bits where it doesn't match up with the scenes on Sodor, like engines being on different places than in previous shots. But thankfully it's mostly smaller moments that can be glossed over. Another problem comes, once again, from the human side of things, which is the sort of forced voiceover. Because a lot of things ended up being cut from this film, there wasn't much left for character interactions, so during scenes where some human characters are travelling to different places, they decide to dub some random voiceover bits just to give them more interactions, even though it's quite clear they weren't saying anything to each other. Otherwise we'd get scenes of them actually saying that on the journey to get facial interactions.
Here, Grandpa. This is a friendship bracelet. Grandma taught me how to make one when I was little. This one's for you.
Thank you, Lily.
I see the attempt to try and make the most out of what was left on the production, but it just feels a bit lazy and slapdashed. Aside from that, everything else is brilliant. The scenes filmed in the human world is pretty good, if a tad childish with how the station is designed and how comedically surreal with how people act in this town, especially in the scene where we first see the place. Like a guy juggling whilst in a phone box, kids generically running round, or a kid showing a woman with red hair his goldfish trying to be, "Oh wow, we're so happy and whimsical," when really it's just odd. The scenes filmed in the mountains of the Isle of Man are very pretty to look at. And maybe that's my bias of growing up living near the forests and steep hills, but I don't care, it looks really nice. For as confusing and weird as the plot with the human characters is, at least they nailed the film's locations. Everything on Sodor, meanwhile, is wonderful. Seeing so many familiar locations on wide film screen, while they aren't named, is a joyous sight to behold. And I attribute that to the production crew spending 5 series beforehand perfecting their craft, as well as having the main man himself, David Mitten, involved. Everything has that warm, fuzzy Sodor feeling to it, and the nighttime shots especially look gorgeous. My favourite being this shot of Percy pulling the post train. Oh, that's right, they incorporated a little scene in the film with Thomas and Percy with the post trains, tying a plot point to the Series 3 episode. I like that too. As for something that's new to the franchise, for the first time each character is given their own voice rather than having the narrator voice them all. Or at least this was the first time for the UK and the US, given that actually way back in Series 1, when it was first brought to Japan, that was the official first time that they were given unique voices.
Thomas め覚えてろいつか仕返ししてやるからな
やだよ雨に濡れると僕の素敵なグリーンのボディや赤いストライプがダメになっちゃうんだもん
そうか君がそんな風にちゃんとしているのはきっと靴紐のおかげなんだろうななんて失礼な
But I'm getting ahead of myself here. The voices these characters have in this film I think range from okay to great. I don't really know how to feel about the voice for Henry. Like in this scene he sounds good, if a bit too American for what's supposed to be a British engine.
Toby's right. Diesel knows that the lost engine in the legend really exists.
What engine? What legend?
Of an engine whose magic makes her more powerful than Diesel will ever be. That's why he wants to find her.
But then in scenes when he's supposed to be ill, he sounds too wimpy and pathetic.
My smoke box doesn't feel suddy. It feels stuffed up.
Maybe I'm still salty over the special coal inconsistency, but who knows. Splatter and Dodger's voices I don't think stand out either, they're just the generic dumb villain henchman voices. But all the rest, even Diesel 10, are very entertaining and fit their personalities. While I think it would have been awesome to hear John Bellis and Michael Angelis as Thomas, Percy and James, I still think they sound how I would expect them to sound on the big screen.
Then we'd better find her first. Leave it to the big engines, Percy.
Little engines can do big things, especially when they have nice blue paint like me.
But what has to be, without a doubt, the best thing about this production design is the music. This was the first Model Thomas project not to feature Mike and Jr. composing the score, though personally I would have loved this to have been their cinematic debut in music. While some of this soundtrack features some of their original work, like the original theme song at the start, and the really useful engine song segment in the middle of the film,
puffs and whistles, rushing to and fro. He's the really useful engine we adore.
The rest is completely original music composed by musician Hummy Man, and he absolutely knocked it out of the park. He took full advantage of having an orchestra to work with, and the results honestly make me believe that this is the tried and true magic to this film. Like, Mike and Junior's music is more memorable with its catchier tunes, but this is still fantastic. In fact, my favourite part of the soundtrack would have to be when they're travelling along the Magic Railroad. I know, one of my least favourite parts of the film, and it has my favourite music piece, but just listen to it. It's nice to know that besides not making up for the story and the overall concept of the film, they at least got some stuff right when making this. But music and looks aren't everything after all, and the final results couldn't save it, which leads us to... With a final production cost of 13 million quid, the film was released to the world on the 14th of July 2000. To which it gained slightly positive reviews on its opening weekend, but would very quickly have reviews drop to mixed and terrible, today sitting at 21% on film review site Rotten Tomatoes. It made its money back in the domestic box office and sold well in merchandise, VHS and DVD releases, but was still considered a flop. Many consider this to be the reason why Alec Baldwin left the narration role for the show after Series 6, and why Mara Wilson retired from acting. But without a doubt, the worst thing that happened was what it caused Britt to do. What was supposed to be her biggest and most successful project ended up being one of her most infamous, and as a result, she was forced to take the fall for the film's failure and step down as company deputy chairperson of her own company. Also, just wanted to add this as a side note, but apparently this was when Britt Allcroft Productions changed its name to Carlin Entertainment, not Series 3 like I originally put in my review, so I apologise on that mistake. I'll explain more about how this would unfortunately spell bad news for the future of Thomas and Friends whenever I get to reviewing Series 6, but let's just say that this would be the beginning of the show's first major downfall. However, years after this film came out, it would later receive a cult following from the Thomas and Friends fandom. Many fans love to talk about how while it wasn't the best film, it was something they hold very close to their hearts, some even making their own adaptations of scenes from the film either with toys or with Trains Simulator. And in 2020, on the 25th of August, a large part of that same fandom, led by one Mr. Conductor fan 1406, released a 3-hour adult parody of the film that had taken them 4 years to make. If that isn't devotion to a franchise film, then I don't know what is. I'd say watch at your own risk because it is a very weird production that only long-time fans would get full enjoyment out of. To other audiences, it'd be a weird acid trip. Kind of like the original Magic Railroad actually. There was even a 20th anniversary Blu-ray release in the US, complete with interviews with the actors and the production crew, and bonus features of the deleted scenes meant to be in the original film. You know how this show meant a lot to my childhood, and still does mean a lot to me to this day? Well, I mean, you know, like, no shit. So please, look me in the eye and explain to me how this film not only came out 2 months before I was born, September 2000, but how the 20th anniversary Blu-ray edition was also released on the date of my birth, September 29th. Was this destiny? Was I always meant to become a fan of the franchise? To review this film years later? Am I to blame for this? Or am I just out of things to say? Definitely that. On to the conclusion. As a whole, it's weird to try and rank this. While it overall fails at capturing the spirit of the show, there are a hell of a lot worse things that have since happened to the show by a wide margin. I can call it the worst thing that the classic series ever produced, but I can't say it's bad as I do get some genuine and ironic enjoyment out of watching this film. Would I watch it over the classic series? Get the fuck out of here. No way would I do that. It's not god awful despite its numerous flaws. It's not brilliant despite what it does right. But calling it okay/average doesn't feel right either, as it would just undermine just how good and bad those different factors of this film are. Whatever it is, It's an experience that I enjoyed for the right and wrong reasons. If anything, it reminds me of why I loved this show in the first place. The bad parts make it appear as an everyday childish kids show with no dignity that the classic series mocked in its prime, and the good parts remind me that no matter how dumb the show can and will get at points, fans like myself will keep watching because we care so much about the books and the show that made our childhoods, and every so often, we get glimmers of that magic. Not literal magic like the gold dust, the magic trains or magic railway lines, but the magical charm, style, sound and appeal of a world of talking steam engines. And with all that's going on recently with the terrible new makeover, it's important we remain hopeful that bad moments like this won't last forever. What this film represents to us right now is a reminder that wherever the show may fall, we will continue to remember the old show, either by discussing the show in depth with each other or making our own content and stories, to honour Wilbur Awdry's legacy, the show's creativity, and keep the magic alive for the next generation. And thus, Thomas and the Magic Railroad will forever take its place in history as a fascinating disaster. So what now? Well, I'm going to be taking a break from reviewing Thomas content. I know that I said that throughout the summer I'd be reviewing the entire series, but given that I'd never done anything like this before, it definitely tired me out more than I thought it would. It took me way longer than I originally planned in my head. So, I'm going to be taking a break from the franchise. I definitely, plan to return to the series at some point in the future, but for now I want to focus on other stuff. So, I hope that you guys enjoyed these videos, and I greatly appreciate you watching them because the views that they gained in less than a month, especially my Series 4 and Series 5 reviews for this channel, is amazing. So, have a good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time you're watching this, and I'll see you guys on Halloween where I have something special planned for you. But until then, see you in a bit.
It's Thomas the Tank Engine, hip 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 hooray. Chugga chugga chug chug chuff chuff chuff, he rides along the way. And when you hear that whistle, it can only be one train. Our favorite little engine, Thomas is his name. Thomas the Tank Engine rolling along. All of his friends will be coming along. Thomas, we love you. There's Gordon and Henry, Edward, James and Toby.